good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are. You are listening to The Shift. I hope it finds you well. You are listening to the July 19th, 2017 episode. This is the fifth episode of The Shift that I've produced. I'm going to be interviewing Jason Goodman of Crowdsource the Truth today. If you like what you're listening to, please help us out at Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/The Shift. You can get more information on Facebook at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join the conversation on Twitter at Doug McKenty or on the internet at www.theshiftnow.com. So my guest today is Jason Goodman, executive producer of the online alternative media sensation Crowdsource the Truth, which can be found on Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, and Twitter, as well as other various social media platforms. Jason heads up the Crowdsource the Truth team, comprised of George Webb and Patricia Negron, aka Trish the Dish, among others. Together, they create a highly interactive content with the intention of utilizing the entire crowdsource community in order to shed light on and spread the word about some of the most important yet underreported issues of our time. Whether producing live updates, mini documentaries, or in-depth interviews, Crowdsource the Truth discusses in great detail what the mainstream media will not. Jason, thanks for helping to make the shift and being on the show today.
Doug, thanks for that great intro. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, you bet. Why don't you give us then, just to start out, a little bit of your history? Well, first, why don't you tell people where to find out about you? I think YouTube is where I first found out about you, but just let people know, and then give us a little bit of the history. I know, like, you started out in Hollywood, right? You helped out with Spider-Man 3, and then what got you into doing Crowdsource the Truth from there?
Well, I started out before I went to Hollywood. I've always been fascinated with stereoscopic 3D production, and so for about the past 25 years, I've been developing camera technology and optical technology that's been utilized in 3D production, initially for corporate and special venue things like ride films and stuff like that. And of course, after Avatar came out in 2009 and 3D became kind of a mainstream Hollywood thing, I moved out to LA and started getting involved in bigger and bigger productions. And my production company, 21st Century 3D, grew to some degree of international notoriety. I've got certain patents in 3D technology that have been utilized by Panasonic and Sony, and I've developed camera technology for Sony. And so after about 2013, I had been doing work on some larger feature films, Amazing Spider-Man and X-Men Days of Futures Past, Metallica Through the Never.
Nice.
But, because of change, that was a good one.
Right.
Because of changes in technology, and actually I found out from working in, the news industry and getting more and more involved in politics, actually NAFTA played a role in this, but there was a huge discount for Canadian visual effects companies and, of course, Chinese visual effects companies, Indian visual effects companies. Sorry about that. That resulted in the productions in Hollywood shifting more towards shooting in a traditional way and using visual effects to convert the films to 3D. So my production business dropped off substantially, and I had to make a change in my career and in my life, and I moved back to New York and just decided I was a little bit kind of over the Hollywood thing, and to some extent even over 3D. I've spent a lot of time in my life working on it. I still enjoy it, but I just, particularly after the 2016 election or during the election cycle, I became so frustrated with the amount of obviously false information that was being spread around on social media. And I mean, I've been maligned a bit for this online, but I came back to my, my Spider-Man sort of way of thinking, and I thought to myself, with this great power of social media comes a certain degree of responsibility that we each have.
Absolutely, right? I love it.
Right, the Spider-Man. And I just was getting really upset that people were disseminating these false stories without doing any research, without really, and a lot of people felt like, well, I saw it on CNN and Fox and read it in the Washington Post, so it must be true.
For sure.
I didn't leave it at that. If someone said, hey, Donald Trump's doctor is fake, I went to the, medical board and found the guy's records, and I went to his office and made sure that that was him there in the office, and I spoke to the doorman at the building who told me he's been a doctor in the building, and the guy worked there for 8 years, and I wanted to verify this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my favorite thing about checking into your stuff. I actually first heard about you guys because I was looking into the Seth Rich situation to find out what kind of truth there was behind that, and I find out that you and George actually bother to go find that detective, Rob Wheeler, and sit down with
Right.
him for an hour. And I was like, who are these guys? This is incredible. And George is going like, well, yeah, I did that walk. You know, I went to the bar where Seth Rich was at and I walked to his house to find out how long it would take. I'm going,
Yeah.
this is real investigative journalism. I mean, I haven't seen anything like this. And, you know, it's just so nice to see actually that you're willing to take the time out of your life and then, you know, share it on the internet with us, that this is what you know, what really happens when you start to look into these things that we all hear, you know. And the way the mainstream media is operating, like you say, they just blow stuff off, or they're not really reporting any of this, or they're calling it fake news, which was the
Right.
establishment's reaction to what we were getting at social media. That it was very
Hmm.
refreshing to see you guys, you know, really going in depth, like on the ground, getting your hands dirty to find out the truth behind some of this information that's kind of bubbling to the surface, but you don't really know, you know, what's true and what's not. So I thank you for that.
Right. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. I mean, yeah, you said it. It's the only way to really figure it out. And like putting together that Rod Wheeler interview was pretty tricky. I had to call him and text him a bunch of
Right.
times. I mean, Rod was very, very, very helpful, but obviously he's in a challenging situation. The family doesn't want him to speak about it that much, and I don't know how much you want to get into the whole Seth Rich case, but I was actually just speaking to Dr. Jerome Corsi about that. He had an article come out in Infowars yesterday or Monday talking about how the FBI is, the Metro PD, the DC police have changed things in their report that indicate that the FBI lied or, changed the time. And there's all this crazy stuff surrounding that investigation. I mean, there's this complicated story about how a gun was stolen out of an FBI car and that it was an FBI gun with this special type of subsonic ammunition. And that's why no one in the neighborhood heard the shot, because it was, normally with a gun, you fire it and there's the bang of the explosive charge that sends the projectile out, as well as the bullet itself breaking the sound barrier, creating a loud bang there. So their explanation was, well, no one heard the shot because it was a subsonic bullet and all this and that. I just say there's no proof the guy is dead. We haven't seen the death
Wow. Right.
certificate, haven't seen an autopsy.
Interesting.
One of our crowdsource community members just texted me today that she's been following Matt Couch. And, Matt, I consider a friend of the show. We've had him on. I'm intrigued by his investigation. This person told me that Matt is meeting some degree of frustration in his ongoing investigation of Omaha. Our crowdsource community also told me that in investigating Seth Rich as a creditor or an employer would, he's still not categorized as deceased.
Wow.
So it's interesting. Yeah, when you go to all of these, standard channels, there's no record of the guy being dead. And of course, Rod Wheeler, he's not just a private detective. He was a DC homicide detective for 5 years. And in his own words, that interview that you were talking about that's on the Crowdsource the Truth YouTube channel, people can see, he says that never happens. George and I had an off-the-record interview with another retired DC Metro police officer who actually taught at the police academy. One of his students was the chief of police, Kathy Lanier, who left Metro PD about 6 weeks after the Seth Rich case, no longer works there. And this retired police academy instructor said he was shocked by the details we were telling him. He also said that never happens. 3 body cameras, no footage.
Right.
So it's very interesting how this cover up is happening. Kathy Lanier, who was the chief of police at the time, in her own words, said that the department was broken beyond repair. So it does seem that there is some degree of corruption, and it's not to malign the officers of the DC Metro Police Department, who are obviously risking their lives to protect the citizens of Washington, D.C., but I think we can see from situations in the FBI with people like James Comey and Andrew McCabe, you don't need really that many people, if you just have the guy at the top under control.
Right.
And again, it's also, I don't want people to think that I'm saying, oh, everybody is there like Snidely Whiplash, twirling their mustache, carrying out these evil plans. What we're discovering is a lot of times people are forced into these situations where they're coerced and they're influenced to do things that they wouldn't normally do. So it's complicated. Nothing is cut and dry. And we've certainly been going down the rabbit hole with this stuff, and it is deep and twisted. So
That's one of the things that you guys have actually been. I mean, I thought I was pretty well informed when it came to a lot of this stuff, and you've actually been opening my eyes to a few things that I didn't know about. I'm going, wow. Well, let's take a step back because we could talk
Sure.
about this kind of stuff all day. There's so many complicated issues that are, and you guys get
Hmm.
into such detail about it, which is what I love about what I'm hearing from you and George and Trish. But will you, before we get any deeper into that, tell us about how you got involved with George, a little bit about his background, and Trish as well, so we can kind of get a feel for the team that's working on this.
Sure. Well, as I said, when I left Hollywood and came back to New York, my financial situation deteriorated and I needed to come up with an idea for how to make money. And because I had spent so many years running my own business in 21st century 3D, and it was so specialized and so niche. I mean, it wasn't like I could crack open the classified ads and find a job for a 3D stereographer or a camera designer or anything like
Right.
that. And I did try to work at a couple of virtual reality startup companies, GoPro, and well, not to run through a list and name the companies, but there are a number of companies that are working in virtual reality, and most of these companies were looking for guys who are 25, know how to program, and I had a very sort of specific set of skills, and it was hard to find employment. And I became very interested in the news, very interested in the deceptions or what I saw as deceptive news. And that might be an unfair word to use, but when you look at things like, I've spoken on our program about things like the movie Vaxxed, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that film,
Yeah.
but I found it very interesting. Yeah. And I mean, for the longest time, people were saying like, oh, somebody, you're either for vaccines or you're anti-vax. And when I saw that film and I really looked at the evidence that it presented from scientists and doctors and people who have really existed in this field, and it's not this surface level black and white thing. You learn about how laws were manipulated in 1984 to make it illegal for families with children who are injured by vaccines to sue the pharmaceutical
Right.
company. Learn that the CDC suppresses this research that this one specific vaccine was having an unbelievably high rate of injury on children in a specific age range, and particularly black male children 18 to 36 months. And when you start to look at that, you realize it's not an issue of vax or anti-vax. The other thing that law in 1984 did was it reclassified vaccines as biologicals instead of pharmaceuticals, and they were subject to a far less rigorous testing process than a pharmaceutical drug would be. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why is that? Wouldn't we want I mean, I consider a vaccine a drug or a pharmaceutical, it's something a doctor is injecting in a baby. Wouldn't you want to test that as rigorously as any other medical procedure or any other drug that you're putting into someone's body? And so, you start to ask these questions and you realize that the guy that produced Vaxxed had to leave his job in the mainstream news because the news show, which is mostly advertising pharmaceutical products, they don't want to bite the hand that's feeding them, so they can't really run a story on this. So I really started to think about how these corporate-controlled, advertiser-driven, news programs, how are they giving you information? How can they possibly be giving you honest information? So with Crowdsource the Truth, I've made a real concerted effort to avoid advertising, to avoid monetization by corporate entities like YouTube or Google or anything like that. And we're really making a strong effort to have it be community supported, where each individual becomes a sponsor for whatever amount they want. And we're just trying to open it up like that. Now, the way that I got in touch with George was very organic. I have always been interested in things like the JFK assassination, 9/11, things that, look, whatever somebody believes, there's no doubt there's controversy surrounding these issues. Why has the murder of JFK been the most famous, conspiracy theory of all time? Is it because there's been a really clear and thorough investigation of that murder and there's irrefutable evidence one way or another? Or is it because there's a lot of weird coincidences surrounding it at best? So, I had a knee injury several years ago, and I was in a position where I needed to go to the gym for, an hour or more per day, and I just had a lot of time on my hands each day, and I was watching videos on YouTube, and I was focusing on documentaries about things like JFK, and of course the computer learning algorithm or whatever YouTube uses, they're like, hey, if you like this video about JFK, maybe you like this video about Watergate, maybe you like this video about Enron, maybe you like this video about, the mortgage crisis. And what I found so interesting was that I was learning more, not to say that I believed every video that I saw on YouTube. I watched them all with a high degree of skepticism, But I was exposing myself to so much information, and information that was created by so many different sources. I mean, news footage from 1963, documentary films made by the BBC, corporate films made by Saudi Aramco, just all kinds of, and I mean, even, podcasts like this, just made by individuals like you and me. And it runs the gamut, the information that you get from that. And when you apply, as I said, skepticism and critical thinking to these things, I feel like I learned more from that in 2 years than I did from my whole entire time in public school. So George was one of the guys that came up in that search. And I was fascinated by what he was talking about. I mean, anybody who's watched George's, okay, day 156, his style of evidence-based videos,
Right.
your initial thing is like, what the hell is this guy talking about? I got this gigantic face here, walking around with this shaky cam, looking at blood spatters and looking at clocks and bridges and all this, it's a little bit esoteric. And I think for some people, if they're not spoon-fed an easy answer that immediately becomes obvious, they just think like, well, this guy's a conspiracy theorist, or he has no proof, or he's just spouting crazy theories. But that is not it at all. And, George has become one of my closest friends in the months that we've been working together. And certainly we're working together daily and quite extensively. And that's not to say that I can think the way that George thinks. He's got a unique mind, and he's one of the most profound geniuses I've ever encountered. But I'm starting to understand the George language. And I've equated it to, like, I've traveled around the world quite a lot in my career in filmmaking, and sometimes maybe I'll be in an airport in France, let's say, and I'll see a 5-year-old kid speaking French fluently, and I just think, like, how can that kid speak French and I can't understand a word of it? I mean, surely that kid doesn't have the wisdom or education that I do, but he can speak French and I can't. Now, just the fact that I can't speak French or Chinese or Russian, does that make it gibberish? Does that make it nonsense? Or is it just that I don't fully understand it yet? Now, if you were to embed yourself in France or China or Russia or the United States, I mean, we all learn. You could sit a 1-year-old baby down and give him a course on how to speak English, and he's not going to learn it. Mm-hmm. But just being exposed to it again and again, you begin to start to understand this language. And what I've come to understand is that people like George and people like Julian Assange and Eric Braverman and some of the people that are sort of involved in this thing either on the periphery or at a very high level, they're not necessarily speaking so on the nose. I mean, Julian Assange, one of the things that people have said, just to get back to Seth Rich for a moment, one of the elements of evidence, and that's another important factor I find, is that most people can't differentiate between proof, evidence, and just a random statement. Mm-hmm. But one of the elements of evidence that people frequently go to as proof that Seth Rich was the leaker to WikiLeaks is this television interview on Dutch television in which Julian Assange begins speaking about a 27-year-old employee at the DNC who was shot in the back, and that he's offering this $20,000 reward for any tips that lead to the capture of the murderers. Now, is Julian Assange offering that reward because Seth Rich was his friend, his associate, the leaker, a source for WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange is so indignant that someone would kill one of his leakers that he's putting out this reward? Or does Julian Assange know that the entire notion of this Seth Rich murder is a fake hoax story designed to deflect us from the actual leaker, who is Eric Braverman, and is Julian Assange offering that reward so that people start looking at it and start thinking about it? And isn't it interesting that no one has come forward with any evidence in this supposed murder, despite the fact that it was just a botched robbery conducted by 2 people. There's over $100,000 in reward. Now, look, was Seth Rich shot with 2 guns and a barrage of bullets, or is there one guy who shot a gun and one guy who ran away, who might come forward and say, look, I was there, but I didn't know the other guy had a gun, and I'll give you evidence if you give me the $100,000. $100,000 is a lot of money to somebody that would shoot somebody on the street to do a robbery for a watch, a cell phone, and a wallet that they didn't even take. So I'm not saying that this is what happened. I'm just saying, in the absence of a death certificate, in the absence of an autopsy, in the absence of any photographic evidence, any ballistic evidence, any of the things that are normally in place, and Seth Rich is not the 35th president of the United States. Abraham Zapruder did not operate the body cams on those police officers. So there shouldn't be so much mystery surrounding the death of a 27-year-old man in Washington, D.C. It should be the police have the evidence, here's the certificate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something going on there. I don't know what it is, but I do not believe it's what we've been told.
Right. It was funny to hear Rod Wheeler talking about, door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. And when he got door number 1, I think it was just a robbery. Door number 2 was, whenever you're investigating a murder, these are the things that the steps you go through. Door number 2 is a relative or a lover did it, because that is often the case. And door number 3 is somebody at work did it. When he got to door number 3, nobody wanted to talk to him. The door stayed shut. And that means that there's something weird going on there. I mean, we can't say necessarily what it is, but why aren't they just letting us know what's happening? And, certainly then you guys, you and George have gotten so much information about this Seth Rich case that it's through the roof. Really, you start looking into it. That interview you touched upon with Jerome Corsi, where you had an outline going back for months, just like boom, boom, boom. Well, you can't call this fake news, right? I mean, at a certain point, there's something there. Like, well, the mainstream media is not touching it, which goes back to another thing that you were talking about. And I've realized this too, because I've done enough of these kinds of interviews and talked to people like you. And I've wondered why, and I think about what is conspiracy theory or what is reality. And what I've come down to it is it's what people trust. If somebody trusts the Washington Post and the New York Times, you can talk till you're blue in the face and they're going to go, well, these are legitimate news sources. What are you talking about? Your YouTube channel, And it's like you have to, and 9 times out of 10, or really 99 times out of 100, you can't get them to go and talk and look at the facts like you're talking about, like George Webb does. He goes and he's analyzing these facts, fact by fact. And if you can get anybody to do this, then you're going, yeah, this isn't fake news. Why the corporate media can whitewash something this important? Well, I mean, we can talk about that a little while. Why do you think the corporate media does do such a bad job? I think the advertising is a big part of it, the corporate money, but they seem to actually, gosh, we have so much to talk about. Basically, what you start to uncover is that there's an immense amount of corruption in the system, in this corporate system and in the government system, and the mainstream media, the corporate media seems to help cover it up. It's not actually doing the kind of investigation that you and George are doing at Crowdsourcing the Truth.
Yeah. Well, while I don't want to implicate every person working in a corporate media outlet, I'm not going to say that I disagree with the position that you've just put forward. I think part of the problem is whether we're talking about a news program, a newspaper, or a law enforcement agency like the DC Metro Police, even if 99.9% of the people there are interested in doing the right thing, they're not in charge. And, if you've got rent to pay or a mortgage to pay or a baby to feed or a husband or a wife or, all the things that we all have, people aren't always in the position to stand up and say, well, I'm going to sell all my 3D camera equipment and start a company, get, a bunch of people to tell me I'm an idiot and conspiracy theorist for months before I get any traction. It's not easy. It's not easy. And, I'm glad you brought up that whole door number 1, door number 2, door number 3 thing, because this all is so tied together. The corporate media, whether you're CNN or ABC News or whatever, they've got to productize this. They've got to package this, and they've got to do it in a way that, CNN is not going to put out a show where 90% of the people spend a year telling Jake Tapper or someone that he's an idiot or a conspiracy theorist or whatever. They need to run that business. They need to sell advertising. They need to give you something palatable that the majority of people like and want. And it goes so far back as far as, people's view of the government, people's view of the country, people's view of themselves. They don't want to shake up the system. That's part of it, of course. And, part of the reason why we are able to go so in depth and do an hour and 20-minute intelligence assessment with Dr. Corsi and put that out there as a program is because I don't care if Coca-Cola doesn't want to advertise on that. I don't care if Pfizer doesn't like the fact that we're saying, or Merck or whoever doesn't like the fact that I say that they are paying someone at the CDC or might be offering jobs to people who are at the CDC after they leave the CDC to manipulate things. I don't care if Searle Pharmaceuticals doesn't like it that I say that Donald Rumsfeld was the CEO when aspartame, the most toxic food additive ever devised, was approved by the FDA. I don't care. I don't even care if someone says, hey, this is too long. I get emails from people who say, make your show shorter. It's too long for me to watch. It's like, well, guess what? Turn it off.
Right.
There are people who want to sit there and watch it. And I don't mean to be rude. I do want people to be engaged and I do want people to watch it. But the point is, so, the issue has come up of like, hey, wait a minute. Sometimes you guys are on at 8 in the morning. Sometimes you're on at 11. Sometimes you're on at 9 o'clock at night. And it's like, this is a whole new paradigm, Doug, right? Like even what you and I are
I'm doing it too. I'm right there with you.
10 years ago, nobody was calling me. I'm not getting on CNN even now.
Right.
And it's not to compare you or I to CNN. It's just that we've got this medium now and we can use it however we want. And you're going to shoot this video, whether it goes out live or you put it on your YouTube channel or your Facebook page or Periscope or wherever you want to put it. 20 years from now, this could still be here. And if someone wants to go to it and look at it, they can. And that's the way I'm looking at pieces like that thing with Dr. Corsi or the interview with Rod Wheeler. I mean, they are really kind of little pieces of history. And who knows where this Seth Rich investigation will go. But, I have tremendous respect for Rod Wheeler, not only because he was a police detective and he's obviously dealing with dangerous criminals. Murder was a part of that guy's day-to-day life. I know I don't, and I don't think the average person really understands the mindset of someone who's working as a police homicide detective where every day you're dealing with another death. Not even in terms of a doctor. Like I've known a lot of doctors. There are doctors in my family and everything. And you've got to have a certain mindset to be able to take on the responsibility of saving someone's life and understand that in the course of a 20, 30, 50-year career as a doctor, there's a lot of people you're going to deal with that are going to die. And I think if you or I ever felt any sense of responsibility for someone's death, that could be devastating. So doctors are thinking in a different way. A homicide detective, I mean, this is a guy that knows that there are evil people in the world and death is happening. So it's possible that his whole approach to life is somehow different than you and I. And when Rod Wheeler, I mean, he's also one of the most charismatic and intelligent guys I've ever spoken to. There was something about him that was just magnetic. You wanted to sit there and talk to him.
It was an amazing interview. I mean, he really, not only because he had to be reserved because he wasn't allowed to talk about the case, and to watch him like give you bits of information that he could legally give you, but then not talk directly about the case. It was fascinating. It was like I was enthralled. Right. Like this is the real deal. This is the real information, as good as it's going to get about the Seth Rich case right now.
That's right. And when he started talking about that door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, I really encourage people to watch that interview, to watch the Dr. Corsi interview. There's when Trish and I went to Oxford to see Eric Braverman speak. People should go onto YouTube and just put in the search bar on YouTube, Braverman Blavatnik, and see the seminar of the 4 people at the Blavatnik School of Government and listen to what everybody is saying. Because just like George, just like Julian Assange, just like all of these people that we're talking about right now, they're not coming out and telling you, hey, somebody stuck a gun in Seth Rich's back and pulled the trigger. There's a subtext to what each of these people are saying. And I believe when Rod Wheeler was telling us door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, it's like, you know what, door number 1 is kind of like the easy way, where you can go work for the Google Foundation and have a nice job and a perfectly tailored suit and a perfectly manicured, hair and look great and be healthy and have food and all the things that we all want in life. That's maybe door number 1. Right. And door number 2 might be, okay, we're going to ruin your career. We're going to have everybody think you're a crazy person. You're going to lose your family life. You're going to lose your professional life. You're going to lose all your money and you're going to hate it. And door number 3 might be a bullet in the back of the head and we drop you in a hole.
Right.
So I think that Rod Wheeler, again, I come back to, this is a guy that understands that there's evil in the world, and no matter how hard he tries as an individual, he's not going to stamp it out. So at a certain point, you've got to look out for yourself. And I understand and respect that. This is what I think. This is my interpretation. And that whole conference in Oxford, Eric Braverman and 3 other individuals are each talking about the impossible difficulties, and I think even Rod Wheeler was talking about this indirectly, of being the one honest person or the one person trying to do the right thing in an inherently corrupt system. There was a gentleman there from Nigeria who talks about, you stick your head up and you're going to get your head chopped off. So how many people are going to do that after you see the heads rolling down the aisle? Maybe not that many.
Now might be a good time to bring up this DNC lawsuit that's going on in Florida right now. I was listening to what you were putting out last night, and this discussion, because I think yesterday on InfoWars, one of the lawyers, came out. They're scared for their lives right now.
As they
I
should be.
mean,
Yeah, there's been a lot of lawyers getting killed in Florida. This is a real, this is no joke. That was Elizabeth
right.
Beck. Jared Beck and Elizabeth Beck are the two lawyers that are doing that DNC lawsuit. And we've been in communication with Jared certainly for a couple of months. And I mean, they're working really hard to do the right thing. And again, they're in this position of trying to do the right thing and fighting corruption. They're sticking their heads up, and obviously, George and I, people have been urging us to go down there and help them. And I mean, I said this last night. We're not law enforcement. We're not police officers. We're not superheroes. There's a limit to the things that we can do to, people expect us to save them in some way. I mean, what we're going to do is we're going to go there and we're going to interview them and, put out another one of our multi-camera sit-down type interviews where they can tell their full story in as much detail as they need to put that story out. Because again, the concept of crowdsource the truth is that we want to put this out. We want you and your viewers and your listeners and everybody who watches our show and everybody who's out there to see this material, because it becomes like this giant human brain powered supercomputer where, we have lawyers, we have compliance experts, we have doctors, we have grandmothers, we have, you don't need to be a homicide detective to get involved with this, because, people come up with all kinds of things. George calls it the family puzzle. And he says, sometimes the adults are sitting around and they have, maybe 50% of the puzzle made. And then the child comes in and says, oh, look, a doggy, and sees something in the puzzle that the adults can't see, and you put in this one piece and suddenly the face of the dog becomes clear, and it's like, oh, look at that. And it's even happened with me and George. Like I said, I mean, I don't have anywhere near the investigative prowess or the intellect that George does, but there have been times that I've said things that just get him to go, a light bulb goes off, and I might say something that I see that he doesn't see that starts him thinking down a whole other path. So that collaboration is incredibly powerful. And we've really sort of created an open source intelligence gathering and assessment organization.
Yeah, it's a beautiful concept. I mean, I really love it. I did an interview with James Corbett of the Corbett Report a few weeks back. He also started the Corbett Report thinking about this idea of open source intelligence, really starting to utilize this thing called the internet that we have now, that lets us find out the stuff that we haven't been able to find out through the mainstream, through the corporatized media for really 50, 60 years. I mean, they've had a lock on this information. And now, as you're saying, putting all of our brain power together, we can really start to reveal what's going on. One of the things I kind of joked with him is that Reddit is now doing better investigative journalism than the Washington Post or the New York Times ever can, because they're so controlled by this, this corporate system that's got a lock, has had in the past a lock on media. But now that we have the internet, we really can create, millions of minds, hopefully eventually getting together and starting to say what really did go on with this Seth Rich situation, because it's not fake news. Or, what is going on with the Podestas, because I don't think that's fake news either. Or what really is happening with these people that are dying in Florida surrounding this DNC lawsuit, which is obviously, it's obvious that the DNC threw that election for Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders should have won. The information is out there, and it's amazing that the mainstream media is not investigating this. They're not doing real investigative journalism anymore. It's up to people like you to put it together on the internet. And we just have to hope that more and more people start jumping on board and helping out, because that's the way that we can collectively start to figure out what's really going on here.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm glad you mentioned James Corbett, because I love his show, and I was watching him for sure. He was an early inspiration. I've seen him on Newsbud with Sibel Edmonds and on the Corbett Report and all that. And it really was inspiring, to see people do that kind of thing. And again, even among the collective of myself, George, and Trish Negron, who, Trish knew George because she was doing sort of more blogging and written journalism. She was writing about George, and then George introduced Trish and I, and we sort of became a triumvirate. And now we bring Trish onto the broadcasts, and she and I traveled to London to investigate, this "Where is Eric Braverman" situation. So even among just the three of us, we're sort of like a mini crowd, and each of us have our capabilities and our viewpoints that come together for a much more powerful collective than we could possibly be individually. And as you said, that's where the power is. And it's an example that I've given before in the past is, like, I think back, I was involved in computers pretty early on, and I remember in about 1985, Apple came out with the Macintosh and the laser printer, and basically offset printing has never been the same. It's gone away. It's now all digital offset, and that industry changed. And then in 1996, Sony came out with the digital video camera, and the iMac really enabled low-cost desktop digital editing. And then we started having films like, the Blair Witch Project for $20,000 making $80 million.
Yeah, right.
And that was essentially asymmetric warfare on Hollywood. And now, in the modern era, 2006 saw the iPhone, and now the evolution of fast LTE networks, and we've got 5G coming, which a lot of our crowdsourced community is saying is maybe not so good, but high-speed networks and 4K video on phones, where what used to be an OB truck with, or a production van with a crew and all kinds of satellite equipment, you've now got that in a $500 cell phone. If you're in Syria, if you're in Washington, D.C., if you are somewhere where news is happening, you flip that thing on, and if you can present and speak on camera and put together a compelling story and present the news in a way that people want to see it, how can CNN, how can MSNBC deal with that? They have Rachel Maddow talking for 20 minutes about the fact that Donald Trump makes $150 million a year. Tell me something I don't know.
Right. Well, it is pretty amazing. I mean, I even come from, I did a radio show here in Mendocino County at kind of the local NPR station, and they were so stuck in that rut of that old media, of that NPR station format, that when I branched out and started doing this podcast, it was suddenly like, I don't have to talk for an hour and then do a station break. I can talk for as long as I want to, and we can cut this together however we need to, and we can get it out. I mean, things are changing so rapidly right now when it comes to this kind of stuff. It's going to be exciting. I hope we can maintain this kind of freedom. I mean, in the next 5 or 10 years, it's really going to change things. I mean, there's still a lot of people out there that are afraid to hear this kind of information. They're so stuck, trusting that people are calling it the dinosaur media now. They've trusted it for so long, especially the older generation. I think the younger guys and girls these days, who grew up with the internet, I mean, CNN needs to watch out, because nobody's going to be paying attention, or the Washington Post or the New York Times. I mean, these people, I hope definitely the younger generation are listening to people like you and I and what we're trying to do here, because we're actually doing, I mean, I not to toot my own horn, but and watching what you're doing is real investigative journalism, real work. And you can watch the mainstream media now. You can look at Rachel Maddow. You're like, what are you talking about? This isn't real investigative journalism. This is, as you say, this is flash. You're pushing, if not straight up government propaganda, which I suspect, and you and George have even talked about this. I think I heard you guys talking about Anderson Cooper recently, where you were like, who is this guy, and what is his affiliation with the CIA? And it's like, yeah.
Well, he admits to having done a college internship at the CIA, and it's one of those things where if they like you in the internship, maybe they offer you a job. So I don't know.
So George has been doing this. This is all from a reporting angle, guy. He almost sounds like he has actual intelligence experience or something, but this is all from him doing independent journalism work for years, that he's gained this knowledge that he's got, because that guy's like an encyclopedia.
It's true. And as I said, I first came to know about George just from YouTube saying, hey, if you like all these other YouTube channels, maybe you'll like George. And that was my first impression, was like, well, I mean, this guy's got to be like an FBI agent, or
sounds like
ex-CIA agent or something. And then there was this whole thing about the Mossad and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, when it comes to all of that, George and I, even though, as I said, we work very closely together and become very, very close friends, it's everything that George tells me is strictly on a need-to-know basis. And that's not to say that I think that George is being untruthful with me. I respect the fact that he just can't tell me everything. And sometimes he doesn't want to tell anybody everything, and he needs to protect his sources, which is an ongoing challenge. Obviously, we need to release information and try and guard people's identities and all that kind of thing. But George has told me that he has never been involved with an intelligence agency of any kind. He has never been an official operative of any agency. He has said on the air that he was involved in a WikiLeaks type network of transferring information for Der Spiegel, which was some sort of predecessor to WikiLeaks. I'm not entirely familiar with that situation, but George is not a citizen of Israel, as far as I know. George is not a member of the Mossad, the CIA. See, now I choke on the word CIA, and people are another conspiracy theory right there. George is just a incredibly intelligent, genius level guy who. Now, his brother has come into this narrative. I don't want to upset him because he doesn't seem to like me very much, but his brother apparently is involved in the Department of Homeland Security or the CIA or something like that. And George has said that I think his college roommate or something was naval intelligence or CIA or something like that. So he obviously has a high level of knowledge of how these agencies work and how this type of government work is done. And he's got extensive knowledge in spycraft and tradecraft and all that kind of thing. But yeah, he's just, he started out as a computer software salesman. He's spoken about having worked for McAfee and IBM and, different companies like that. Unisys, I think he's mentioned. And, it's when I first approached George after seeing his channel, I just said, well, hey, I want to create this sort of internet journalism, not really a news channel. I don't think that I could compete with CNN, and that's not what we're trying to do. But just as we've been discussing, I sort of wanted to sit him down and ask him the questions that I had from watching his show, his series, his channel. Sort of like, okay, you got these guys, the Awan brothers, and watching George's channel is a little bit like, I say, drinking from a fire hose, because the information is coming at you so fast. It's like speaking to a 5-year-old kid in the airport in French when you don't speak French. I mean, that kid can speak as slowly as you want. You're just never going to get it until you start to learn to speak French. Now, if you spent a year with a French-speaking person, you would eventually begin to understand what they're saying. It's just the natural way that we all learn language. So, my first approach to George put out a piece where he said he was looking to meet with Lee Stranahan in Washington, D.C., and that was his crowdsource approach. He would just say, hey, I want to talk to Lee Stranahan. Lee Stranahan's a good journalist. I knew Lee. I saw that episode. I sent George Lee's phone number, and then George and Lee met up, and then, George and I were connected now, and George put out another episode where he's coming to New York, and I said, hey, why don't you come over and we'll do an interview, and I'll ask you some questions and try to clarify some of the questions that I had. And it turns out a lot of the questions that I had were the exact same questions everybody else had. So, people enjoyed that interview, and that became, one of the videos on the Crowdsource the Truth Facebook, YouTube channel. And I just started doing that. I interviewed Lee, I interviewed George, and we interviewed Dr. Corsi, just started doing these interviews. And, just through the course of doing that, George and I were communicating more, and we started working together, and I just told him I want to get involved in this investigation with you. And I started bringing, sort of more and more complex production value to it. And, we were right when we were about to go see Dr. Corsi. George was in Brooklyn investigating the Clinton Foundation, and I was at my place in New York City, and he got into this whole thing with, SEIU trying to corner him in the hotel, and it was pretty hectic. Johnny T came and kind of helped him get out of the hotel, and really from then on, George and I have been really embedded in this investigation together, and it's been really interesting.
Yeah, it's starting to produce some really good work. And I have actually noticed that sometimes you have to almost interpret for George, because he'll just be talking fact after fact, and it's like, what? And you're able to be like, okay, the crowdsource community is asking, what is this term and what does that mean and how does this come together? But it makes for a great, you guys make a great pair, because then the information starts to kind of filter out in a way that the audience can understand.
Right, because George is just thinking on such a high level, and he doesn't realize that the average person has no idea what the hell he's talking about. So I just got to slow him down sometimes. And
it's not even the fault of the culture. The American culture just hasn't been educated about what's really happening.
Right.
They've been given this sort of milquetoast facade from the mainstream media for so long that they don't
Yep.
really know how do you look at the Clinton Foundation and what's going on behind the scenes? What's really happening when, they're covering up this, finding information about Seth Rich? How do you dig into this stuff and discover, the fact from fiction? And I mean, it takes real investigative journalism, and the public's just not even used to it. They haven't had to think critically like that in 50 years, or I don't.
Well, and as you said, Doug, about the real news. I mean, anyone who would say, "Oh, we're fake news or we're alt-right or whatever," I mean, that's a ridiculous characterization. Because in the case of the Clinton Foundation, for instance, we're going directly to Charles Ortel, who is, by any measure, the biggest expert in that legal matter. And it's like, okay, is that guy doing that because he dislikes the Clintons? I don't think so. But even if he is, it doesn't matter, because he's going to legal documents, he's going to financial documents, and he's just telling you it's illegal to use a 501c3 to, receive payments for speeches, $500,000, $700,000. And he's saying, he's in Wall Street. He's spent many, many years in Wall Street, and he deals with CEOs and high-level people of all kinds. And I mean, it's just way out of line for the speaking fees of what people are able to get. And, the average person will say, oh, well, I don't know, Jake Tapper or Rachel Maddow, or, name your favorite Lester Holt or whatever. They told me, well, yeah, he's the president. He gets $700,000 to give a speech. It's like, well, okay, but there's a little bit of a problem if his wife is the Secretary of State,
Right.
and it's a Moscow investment bank that's paying the $500,000, and concurrent with that payment is a Secretary of State, allowing the sale of uranium one. The New York Times did this article, not George and I. The New York Times did an article that said cash flowed to the Clinton Foundation amid the sale of uranium one, and basically this Canadian company, for which the Podesta Group did the lobbying, so they received money from the Russians. They colluded with the Russians.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And the Clintons received $500,000, and this Canadian company got sold to a Russian company that now controls 20% of the uranium mining rights in the United States. And uranium is used to create nuclear fuel for reactors, for nuclear weapons, depleted uranium for these deadly and dangerous munitions.
Right.
That are characterized as illegal chemical weapons by the UN, but yet are being used all over the Middle East, creating an environmental disaster and an ongoing health crisis in Iraq, in Libya, and now Syria, and for our own men and women of the armed forces who, even in the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, they're suffering from Gulf War syndrome. I mean, this is a real, real crisis that the public is just deflected from, because the news, it doesn't sell well.
Well, and as you mentioned, even if they do mention it in the New York Times, and that's what happens so often is, well, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, they just don't even connect the dots of their own reporting. They'll have 4 or 5 or 10 articles about a subject that you and I can read, and the conclusion is, my God, look at the fraudulent behavior coming out of the Clinton Foundation. And they just won't draw that conclusion. They'll have all the information right there, but they won't do the article that ties it all together and says, we need to string these people up. We need to lock them up and throw away the key because they're breaking the law and they're hurting people. Like,
That's
come
right.
on.
That's right.
That's what's really going on here. We got to stop this, right?
And earlier in the call, Doug, you brought up the term conspiracy theory. Okay. Now that is a term that has been so manipulated by the mainstream, for lack of a better phrase. But, what is a conspiracy theory? Well, let's, in the case of Seth Rich, okay, what we're told is 2 guys tried to rob him and he got shot. Now, we don't have pictures of those guys. We don't have those guys coming forward and saying, hey, we did this. So someone's forming a theory about what happened. Mm-hmm. And if it's more than one person, that means that 2 people conspired to do it. So whatever you might say about the Seth Rich case is, in fact, a conspiracy theory. But the term was, after the JFK assassination, there was a directed effort to essentially weaponize that term, and it's now become essentially synonymous with "you're crazy." Yeah. And I remember I was having a conversation with a friend about Vince Foster. And Vince Foster was the special counsel, the assistant special counsel for Bill Clinton. He was basically Bill Clinton's lawyer when he was president. And he died amid very curious circumstances. And, just when I started talking about it, my friend became very agitated, and he said, well, that's a conspiracy theory. I don't want to talk about it. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, it's a conspiracy theory. Okay, well, why do you say that? And I mean, why do you not even want to hear the facts that the photographic evidence in that case was also destroyed in the crime lab, overexposed, unavailable? And there was blood running in 4 different directions on his face. Even though, he was lying downhill, blood was running uphill on his face. How does that happen?
Right.
There was a suicide note in his briefcase ripped into 28 pieces, but no fingerprints on the paper. How does that happen? All these inexplicable things. And, okay, when that happens once in 1993, maybe. But now we've had Bertrand Wiesnant, who was a federal prosecutor. He washes up dead. We've had, Neftali Wax. We've had, there's this guy from Haiti. What was his name? Eberwein. He just committed suicide. I mean, how many people do you know that have committed suicide, Doug? Maybe 0, 1?
Right. For some reason,
the Clintons got like 40.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened.
Right.
So at a certain point, just the mathematical possibility of those being random coincidences just starts to become scientifically impossible. There has to be some correlation. Yeah. And if we're unwilling to look at the evidence and just dismiss it as a conspiracy theory,
yeah,
I don't know what to say.
Pretty amazing, actually, how effective that kind of stuff is. Conspiracy theory. Lately, it's been fake news. I've been hearing, personally, been attacked saying I'm spreading Russian propaganda. When I talk about this stuff now, people literally believe the Russians are influencing
Hacking.
us. Yeah, so that these crazy ideas, it's coming from the Russians. It's not true, because my God, Americans would never murder for power. Only the Russians would do something so horrible.
It's dangerous and it's disturbing, because when that's a nuclear armed country,
yeah,
that is an adversary in some regards, but an ally in other regards. I mean, I've been to Ukraine. I was married to a Ukrainian woman, and you go there, and everybody walking around Ukraine is essentially like you and me. They want to go to dinner and hang out with their family and have a job and have a nice time. It's not like some country filled with evil people, but yet they're so demonized by the press and the government that it's very strange. And the only thing I can really equate it to is, like, if you've ever been lied to by a close friend or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, there's that kind of denial where you can't believe that it's true, and then when you find out, you become angry at the person who's telling you, and it's this cognitive dissonance. It's like, I don't want to hear that. Don't tell me that.
Yeah, it's so true. I've actually gotten to a place in my own interpretation of what's going on that I can interpret the American government almost like a passive aggressive person, or like a narcissist, that goes around into the world and then projects onto everybody else what they're doing, and then pretends like they're not doing it, which is the term is the gaslighting term, which is like they go to the Russians and they're like, no, we're not doing that. You're doing that. And the Russians are like, what? We're killing
George
ISIS in Syria. You're not killing ISIS in Syria. You're just helping the Assad. What? The Russians must be like, what are you talking about? Can we talk about reality now?
George has a really hilarious line in our intelligence assessment with Dr. Corsi, where he says something to the effect of, Hillary Clinton does have a modus operandi of accusing other people of her modus operandi.
Right, yeah, right.
So it's almost like it's like a 5-year-old. They'll break a vase, and then they'll be like, "Oh no, Timmy broke the vase."
Right.
And it's like, well, I didn't do it. What are you talking about? And it's like the second you blame the person, if they turn around and say, I didn't do it, you did it, then they just say, oh, sure, blame me. I did it. Right. You did it. Everybody knows the Russians hacked. The Russians hacked.
Right.
We didn't
hack. Yeah. We've got about 5 minutes. I usually stick these things to around an hour. I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours, so I might as well try to stick to that format. But before we close it up, I wanted to talk for a minute about, because this actually shocked me when I heard George just in preparing for this interview start to talk about this. And this is this new cache of documents that you guys have gotten your hands on about the Silk Way Airlines.
Oh, yeah.
And then George just starts again, like you're talking, George just like a fountain of information starts talking about the 2002 Senate Arms Committee that basically seems to have formed into some kind of cabal selling weapons behind the scenes, these weapons, like you talked about depleted uranium, getting depleted uranium, weapons, things like this, white phosphorus you're talking about,
White
getting white
phosphorus,
phosphorus
right.
into the hands of ISIS, all these things that we've all kind of suspected that there's some kind of rat line. I think a lot of us who do this kind of research heard about maybe the rat line from Libya into Syria to get weapons into the hands of ISIS to fight Assad and all of this covert action. But this whole, I mean, this new evidence, this Silkway transportation company, these ships and these airplanes flying these weapons from like a factory or a warehouse in Bulgaria. And this is
Yeah.
all like McCain and Graham and David Petraeus that are operating this whole thing. Can you talk about that? Because you started talking about this and you have the documentation to back it up. And it's like, God, I mean, these
Right.
guys are slime balls. You know, this is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the exact document that says that those guys are, going there and doing it, but George has linked their companies and their influence in the Senate Armed Services Committee, or as George calls it, the Senate Armed Self-Services Committee, to doing these things. And those documents were originally released by Anonymous Bulgaria, which is a, sort of a hacktivist organization that I don't know how they get this stuff, but it's along the same kind of lines as something like WikiLeaks, where they're doing this to expose corruption. And again, the news will tell you, oh, WikiLeaks is bad and Julian Assange is bad, and they're hurting the government or whatever it is, but they're exposing corruption. And it was originally released on a publication called Trude. A journalist whose first name is Dilyani, and I won't butcher her last name here, but she's a Bulgarian journalist, and she did the initial reporting on this. Someone just sent it to us. Someone in our crowdsourced community sent this to us while George and I were in Washington, D.C., doing some reporting on the Seth Rich vigil. That was the 1-year memorial of his purported death. And somebody sent this to us, and I think we spoke about it and tweeted it out. But we just figured, well, all right, Dilyani's reporting on this through Trude, and Anonymous Bulgaria had released it, so we didn't really get too in depth with it. And then when we got back to New York, we were just sort of, we had wrapped up a broadcast, and we were, just doing some research here at headquarters and getting ready to go have dinner. And we just got an email from, someone in I think it was the initial person who had texted us or tweeted at us the link to the document, and the person said, well, aren't you guys going to release this? Aren't you going to do anything with it? And we just sort of looked at each other and said, well, it's already been released. I mean, what are we going to do with it, And so we looked at it again, and it was like, well, wait a minute. It didn't come out last week. This has been out for 3 weeks. It's been out since June, and you haven't really heard about it in the mainstream media. So why is that? So we downloaded the file and we opened it, and it was filled with thousands and thousands of email messages. And again, I mean, it's like if you're sitting home watching CNN and someone says, oh, Anonymous Bulgaria released a 10 gigabyte file with 15,000 emails in it, you're just sort of like, okay, next, what are you going to do? So what we did was we downloaded the thing and we started looking at these .msg files, which were, archived Outlook messages. And it's not a type of file that I deal with on a daily basis. I tried opening it in Outlook and wasn't having too much success with that. So, we spent a half an hour or an hour looking around for tools that would allow us to deal with these files. And we found this thing on the internet that allowed you to open the files and access the emails and access the attachments, which included PDF documents. Now we're dealing with a regular type of file that everybody has the software tools to look at. And the PDF documents were basically the shipping records of this airline, which is a civil aviation, commercial airline, not intended to be shipping munitions and weaponry around the world. Certainly not banned chemical weapons like depleted uranium and white phosphorus. Right. So as we started looking through these, we just did a video where we were instructing our crowdsource community of how to do this. Because look, let's face it, George and I, even if we were the New York Times, even if we had a bullpen with 50 or 100 researchers, going through thousands of PDF documents, that's a lot of work. But if we have 10,000 people or 12,000 people watching a video and we say, hey, here's what you need to do it, every person looks at just one document. Think about the scalability of that power. And it worked. We had people sending us, hey, look at this. Here's someone shipped a Lexus, and somehow on its way from UAE back to, I think, Pakistan, Lahore, Pakistan, or something like that, the car now weighs almost 1,700 pounds more. So what exactly happened to that car?
Right.
Is there something stored in it? Is it armor plated? What is that? And we're really getting in. I mean, I'm not saying we know what happened. I'm just saying we're starting to do this investigation, and there's all this illicit trade going on, and it is being covered up. That Arsenal factory in Bulgaria is trading in white phosphorus, and that's a dangerous banned chemical weapon. That, we're starting these wars in Iraq and Libya and Syria. Those aren't countries that are coming here and trying to take over Mendocino County or New York City.
Right.
I mean, why are we messing around in these countries? I mean, and then someone like Putin goes to the UN and says, do you guys see what you've done? Do you see the misery that you've brought in Iraq and in Libya? Why do we want to continue this? Now, is that Russian propaganda, or is that just sensible
It
talking?
is amazing. I listen to Putin. Actually, I'll just say it. I tell people, look at what he's saying. I mean, is he this evil person? If he's all he's saying is,
Maybe he is.
well,
I don't know. I don't know. But that statement makes a lot of
yeah,
sense
right. I
to me.
mean, when he's talking about peace, when he's negotiating a deal with Assad that eliminates Assad's chemical weapons in Syria, is that who's like that was good, right? That was a good idea.
I think so.
Like
I
who
think
can
so.
look
And
at
the
that?
United States had a naval vessel that was the one that did eliminate those chemical weapons. So, we're being told a lot of things by
Yeah.
these corporate-controlled, advertiser-driven news outlets that don't make sense, that don't drill down. The other issue that came up was maybe a month or two ago. George has a lot of intelligence sources, and I don't know who these people are. Some of them I've spoken to on the phone, but again, they don't reveal their true identities to me. They don't reveal their backgrounds to me, and I don't know them. But you do start to develop a trust for someone who consistently over months is telling you things that are both credible and then prove to be true.
Right.
So, one of his sources, who is very knowledgeable about the illicit trade in uranium, told him that there was reason to believe that there was depleted uranium on board a Maersk vessel called the Maersk Memphis. And we did a news report about it. And, there was a few thousand people watching the report on YouTube. And they started using this thing called Fleetmon, which is just a website that allows you to track various vessels around the world. It's an open source tool that anybody can create an account on and look at where a boat is, just like you can, if a friend is coming to visit you on a plane, you can track where the airplane is. It's that kind of thing. And the people in the crowdsourced community said, oh, wow, that boat, it's pulling into the port of Charleston right now in South Carolina. So, we started to call the Coast Guard, not to say, hey, we put a bomb on the, we're not calling it a bomb threat. We're calling to say, you know what, we've got credible information that there might be dangerous, illicit radiological material on board that ship. And we didn't say close down the port and create a panic. We said somebody should examine that ship for radioactive material and determine if it's safe. I mean, how many stories did we hear after 9/11 about FBI agents and various law enforcement people and people who went to flight school with the terrorists and the pilot hijackers who said, yeah, I had a piece of information, but I didn't think anything of it, or I couldn't report it properly, or I didn't tell anybody. Why do we want to wait for something bad to happen? If we have reason to believe that there's radiological material on board a ship that is not certified to carry radiological material, and we've identified that the Vienna Convention created this loophole, this dangerous loophole, where people that hold diplomatic passports, diplomats, whatever country they're
Yeah.
from, can have these diplomatic pouches, which started as really a hand purse for carrying personal effects and personal documents, and the pouch is impervious to search and seizure. But over the years, it's grown from a pouch to a suitcase to a steamer trunk to now an entire cargo container.
Right.
So it's certainly conceivable that someone could. And look, in 2015, if you think I just don't like Democrats, or I just don't like Hillary, or I just don't like Barack Obama, that's incorrect. In 2015, the Barack Obama administration determined that the threat of a dirty bomb in one of our ports in the United States was potentially the greatest threat to national security. So in my mind, that signals that if we're engaged in journalism or an investigation of some kind, and a credible individual tells us there's reason to believe that there are 4 containers on board this vessel that are controlled by a company called Awan Brothers Shipping, and we know for 270 days George has been investigating a spy ring in Congress and infiltration by the Pakistani ISI,
Right.
members of which are the Awan brothers, who own 12 houses in the Virginia area, each of which George has visited, each of which has suspicious activity going on. They own upwards of 28 businesses, ranging from fruit canning to shipping logistics to an airline to used car dealerships to mortgage companies. What George has categorized as these cutouts. They own a range of businesses that allow them to conduct activities where they can bring operatives into the United States, conduct their business within the United States without getting credit cards, without purchasing vehicles, without doing things that would create these sort of, digital and paper trail footprints, as George calls them. This is suspicious activity. And to just say, well, we're conspiracy theorists calling in a bomb hoax, I mean, that's really quite stupid.
Yeah.
There is a preponderance of evidence that led us to believe that there was a clear and present danger. And all we said was, hey, Coast Guard, you're supposed to guard the coast. Look at these 4 containers loaded on the Maersk Memphis by Awan Brothers Shipping, as we're told by these publicly available open source tools that anybody can look at. We didn't make those documents. We didn't put those records on Fleetmon. We didn't register the business Awan Brothers Shipping. These guys did. So just look at it, check it out. And if the diplomatic courier won't let you check it out, don't let it into the port.
Right.
Because all you need is a very, very small amount of C4 to vaporize and spread a tremendous amount of extremely dangerous and deadly depleted uranium that would create an environmental catastrophe for the people of Charleston for 4 billion years.
Right.
That's all we're trying to do. We're just trying to prevent that.
Yeah, I mean, what's the most amazing thing about this story, in my mind, is that they're getting away with it, and because this is the crazy amount of corruption that we're seeing, that independent journalists such as yourself, we can uncover that the mainstream media is not telling us about, because there hasn't been real transparency or oversight of these politicians for years. The corruption has gotten to a place where they're operating a gun running operation with illegal weapons, depleted uranium, white phosphorus, under the guise of diplomatic immunity. So nobody's even checking this stuff out because it's the fox in the hen house. I mean, they're just getting away with it. And then, like you say, when you try to do something about it, they just call you a conspiracy theorist.
CNN and the New York Times called George and I conspiracy theorists.
Crazy. Just crazy. Well, we're looking at about an hour and 7 minutes here, so we should probably wrap it up. Like I said, I'd love to keep on talking, but we could talk forever. We'll have to maybe save it for another episode sometime down the line.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Doug. I really appreciate it.
For sure. Do you have anything that you just want to say in conclusion, and tell people how to get in touch with you if they have information that they want to help, if they want to help in the whole crowdsource concept, or if they just want to check out your latest videos? Where do they go?
Well, they can see our videos on YouTube if you just search for Crowdsource the Truth on YouTube, or if you go to Facebook, or even if you just type in crowdsourcethetruth.org, that will take you right to our Facebook page. You can email me tips. You can send me hate mail. You can tell me I'm a conspiracy theorist by emailing me at truth@crowdsourcethetruth.org. Of course, I appreciate kind comments much more. And again, it is a crowdsource community sponsored endeavor. So people that want to become sponsors can go on Patreon, or find all the information about how you can get involved at crowdsourcethetruth.org.
All right. Thanks a lot for being on The Shift. And I just want to let everybody know that you have been watching The Shift. This has been the 5th episode. I've been interviewing Jason Goodman of Crowdsource the Truth. Really appreciate you being on the show. If you want to help out, help up the production value of The Shift here, you can go on our Patreon account, patreon.com/The Shift. More information, look at The Shift with Doug McKenty on Facebook. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, Twitter @DMcKenty. Also on the internet at www.theshiftnow.com. Thanks again for listening. I'm putting out one a week. If you're on YouTube, check out The Shift with Doug McKenty, and you'll see the other 4 episodes I've got up, and all the episodes that I'm about to start producing in the future. So thanks again, and hopefully you'll hear more from us in the future. Take care, everybody.